Welcome to the dairies of science fiction, where extraordinary stories come to life. Enjoy the journey. The observation deck of Orbital Platform Nexus-7 offered a view that never failed to make Ethan Vale feel simultaneously insignificant and essential. 12 vessels hung suspended in the velvet darkness beyond the reinforced plexi steel, each one representing a civilization that had mastered the impossible feat of bending space to their will. He pressed his palm against the cool surface, watching his breath fog the material for just a moment before the station's environmental systems whisked the moisture away. Still brooding like some tragic protagonist, the voice belonged to Collins, his fellow liaison officer, who approached with 2 bulbs of what the station generously called coffee. The delegates arrive in 20 minutes, and you're up here communing with the void. Ethan accepted the bulb and took a cautious sip. The liquid tasted like recycled regret with a hint of synthetic vanilla. Just reminding myself why we're doing this. Trade routes, cultural exchange, the future of humanity among the stars. He paused, also trying to remember if I packed enough antacids for a week of diplomatic dinners. The Accordance Summit had been 3 years in the making, and Ethan's role as xenocultural liaison meant he'd be navigating conversational minefields with species whose idea of small talk might involve anything from quantum philosophy to ritualized insult competitions. The briefing materials alone had taken him 6 months to absorb, and he still wasn't confident he could tell the difference between a Vorath greeting gesture and a declaration of blood vendetta. "I heard the Kaelith delegation is bringing someone interesting," Collins said, waggling his eyebrows in a way that suggested he'd been spending too much time watching ancient Earth sitcoms in the recreation archives. "Apparently she's got a reputation for being, let's say, emotionally expressive." Before Ethan could respond, the station's announcement system chimed. Docking sequence initiated. All personnel to designated greeting stations. The main reception hall had been transformed into something that vaguely resembled a posh Earth hotel lobby. If that lobby had been designed by a committee of aliens with varying concepts of comfort and aesthetics. Gravitational fields shifted subtly across different zones to accommodate species with different physiological needs. The lighting changed in wavelength depending on where you stood, and the air itself seemed to taste different every few meters as atmospheric processors worked overtime. Ethan took his position near the central platform, straightening his formal liaison jacket for the 3rd time. The first delegation emerged from the arrival corridor, and he fell into the familiar rhythm of diplomatic greeting. Bow at precisely 27 degrees for the Vorath. Extended hand, palm up, fingers splayed for the Centauri Collective. A complicated series of hand gestures that he'd practiced in front of a mirror for hours for the Drell Ambassador. Then she walked in. Ethan had reviewed the Kaelith files extensively. He knew they were physiologically similar to humans, the result of either parallel evolution or some ancient mystery the exobiologists were still arguing about. He'd seen the images noting their distinctive ears, elongated and gracefully curved like something from old Earth fantasy illustrations. What the files hadn't prepared him for was the way those ears would flatten almost imperceptibly when she noticed him staring, or the sharp intelligence in eyes that seemed to catalog everything about him in approximately 2 seconds. Lyra moved with a contained energy that reminded Ethan of a thunderstorm trapped in a bottle. Her hair fell in dark waves past her shoulders, and she wore what he assumed was formal Kaelith attire, all flowing fabric in deep purples and blacks that shifted color slightly as she moved through different lighting zones. "Ethan Vale," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent that made each word sound precisely chosen. "I've read your work on cross-cultural misunderstanding protocols. You made several factually incorrect assumptions about Kaelith emotional expression." Collins, standing nearby, made a choking sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Ethan blinked. "I'm sorry, I—" "Don't apologize yet," Lyra interrupted, and now there was something that might have been amusement playing at the corners of her mouth. Wait until I've explained exactly how wrong you were. It should take approximately 6 hours, and I've prepared visual aids. The welcoming banquet occupied the largest assembly hall on Nexus-7, a cavernous space where holographic projections mimicked an Earth sunset on one side and a Voreth binary star system on the other. Ethan had somehow ended up seated between Lyra and Ambassador Seraphine, whose bioluminescent skin cast a soft azure glow across the table. The seating arrangement felt less like coincidence and more like the universe had developed a sense of humor at his expense. The molecular reconstruction units are malfunctioning again, Lyra announced, poking suspiciously at what was supposed to be a traditional Kaelith dish, but looked more like geometric shapes having an existential crisis. This is definitely not Kelrus root. This is an insult to Kelrus root. Seraphine laughed, a sound like crystal bells that made half the table turn to look. Her voice carried natural harmonics that human vocal cords simply couldn't replicate. I find the food here charmingly unpredictable. Yesterday my meal tried to escape the plate. Ethan had been attempting to cut something that resisted with the structural integrity of reinforced hull plating. Station cuisine is an adventure. Sometimes the adventure involves emergency medical services. Lyra's ears twitched forward slightly, and Ethan was beginning to recognize this as a sign of attention. He'd spent the last 3 hours surreptitiously watching those ears, noting how they shifted and angled in ways that seemed connected to her emotional state. The briefing files had mentioned this in clinical terms, but witnessing it felt entirely different. "So tell me, Ethan Vale," Seraphine said, leaning closer in a way that made her luminescence intensify. "What does a xenocultural liaison do when not analyzing our various quirks for academic papers?" "Mostly I panic quietly while trying to remember which species considers eye contact a marriage proposal," Ethan replied. Lyra made a sound that might have been a snort, quickly disguised as a cough. The conversation flowed around the table in a dozen languages, with translation devices creating a slight delay that made everything feel like a badly dubbed ancient film. Ethan found himself explaining a joke about quantum mechanics to a Drell engineer, who responded with a joke about temporal paradoxes that wouldn't be funny for another 3 centuries, which was apparently the entire point. "Your species has an interesting relationship with humor," Lyra observed, finally abandoning her geometric Kelrus root. "You use it like a shield." "And yours doesn't," Ethan asked. "We prefer direct confrontation. It's more efficient." Her ears angled back slightly, also more satisfying. Seraphine touched Ethan's arm, her fingers cool against his sleeve. "You must visit our meditation garden sometime. The bioluminescent flora responds to thought patterns. Very few humans have experienced it." Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but Lyra's hand shot out with remarkable speed, knocking over a crystalline glass. The liquid inside, some kind of Centauri beverage that existed in 3 states of matter simultaneously, spread across the table in a shimmering cascade. It evaporated, solidified, and pooled all at once, creating a spectacular mess. "How clumsy of me," Lyra said, her voice flat in a way that suggested this was anything but accidental. Her ears had pinned completely back against her skull. Collins appeared with absorbent materials, grinning like he just witnessed the galaxy's most entertaining collision. "No harm done, these things happen." But Ethan had seen something in Lyra's eyes just before the glass tipped, a flash of something raw and unguarded. The formal mask had slipped for just an instant, and underneath it he'd glimpsed what looked almost like hurt. The rest of the banquet proceeded without incident, though Ethan noticed Lyra's responses became increasingly monosyllabic whenever Seraphine spoke. The ambassador seemed oblivious, continuing her charming conversation about cultural exchange and diplomatic possibilities. By the time the meal concluded, Ethan's head throbbed from the competing conversational threads, and the station's atmospheric recyclers working overtime to accommodate 12 different species breathing requirements. As delegates began dispersing toward their assigned quarters, Lyra stood abruptly. "I need to review tomorrow's agenda. Excuse me." She left before Ethan could respond, those distinctive ears still pressed flat against her head, visible even as she disappeared into the corridor's shifting lights. "She's intense," Collins observed, appearing at Ethan's shoulder. The Kaelith files weren't exaggerating about the jealousy thing. "That wasn't jealousy," Ethan said, though he wasn't entirely sure what it had been. "That was something else." Ethan found Lyra in Observation Bay 3 at 400 station time, when the artificial day cycle had dimmed the corridors to simulate Earth night. She stood silhouetted against the viewport, her ears backlit by the glow of a distant nebula that painted space in shades of copper and violet. "Do Kaelith not require sleep, or are you just committed to avoiding me?" Ethan asked, stepping into the bay. Lyra didn't turn. "Your species invented the concept of the rhetorical question and then became confused when other species answered them literally." "That's fair." Ethan moved to stand beside her, maintaining what he hoped was a respectful distance. "I wanted to apologize if I said something wrong at dinner." "You didn't," her ears twitched irritably. "You were perfectly polite, charmingly polite. Ambassador Seraphine certainly seemed to appreciate your charm." Ethan watched a transport vessel drift past, its navigation lights blinking in patient rhythm. "So we're doing this then?" "Doing what?" Now she did turn, and her eyes flashed with something that might have been challenge or invitation or possibly both. "The thing where we dance around the actual issue with increasingly elaborate verbal sparring until one of us admits what's really bothering us." Ethan managed a slight smile. "I've read about Kaelith directness. I'm calling your bluff." Lyra's ears flattened, then slowly lifted to a neutral position. For a long moment she said nothing, and Ethan wondered if he'd miscalculated spectacularly. Then she laughed, short and sharp. "You humans are more observant than you pretend to be." "Occupational hazard of my job." She moved to one of the observation benches, settling onto it with a grace that made the simple action look choreographed. "On Kaelith, we have a concept that doesn't translate well into standard. The closest approximation in your language would be heart-showing." Ethan sat down carefully, leaving space between them. "I'm listening." "When something matters to us, we show it, loudly, aggressively by your standards." Her fingers traced invisible patterns on the bench surface. "Hiding affection, disguising care, pretending indifference, these are the deepest insults in our culture. If you don't defend what you value, how can anyone believe you truly value it?" The words rearranged something fundamental in Ethan's understanding. The spilled drink. "That was me being unable to watch someone touch you without my body screaming that I wanted to be the one touching you." She met his gaze directly. "I've been on this station for 8 hours, and already I've violated approximately 47 human social protocols regarding appropriate emotional expression." "That 47 seems specific." "I counted." Her ears angled forward, and Ethan was learning to recognize this as amusement. "Your colleague Collins has been keeping a tally. He thinks I don't notice, but Kaelith hearing is exceptional." Ethan felt laughter building in his chest. "He's actually keeping score. Currently, I'm at 47 acts of what he calls jealous behavior, and 3 instances of what he's labeled territorial aggression." Lyra's expression remained serious, but her ears betrayed her. "The territorial aggression count is unfairly low. I was clearly being territorial at least 6 times." The absurdity of it broke something loose in Ethan, and he laughed properly, the sound echoing in the observation bay. Lyra watched him with an expression that suggested she was cataloging this reaction for future analysis. "So when you corrected my paper in front of everyone," Ethan said when he could speak again, "that was heart-showing. I'd read everything you'd published, every lecture, every panel discussion archived in the galactic database." Her ears flattened slightly, vulnerability creeping into her posture. I wanted you to know I'd paid attention, that you mattered enough for me to prepare a 6-hour rebuttal with visual aids. That's possibly the most academic form of flirtation I've ever encountered. Your species gives flowers, mine gives detailed criticism and supporting documentation. She tilted her head. Although I suppose both involve significant effort and the risk of rejection. Ethan found himself leaning closer without consciously deciding to move. For the record, I didn't find Seraphine's conversation nearly as interesting as watching your ears translate everything you were feeling. Lyra's ears shot straight up in surprise, then slowly angled forward. You were watching my ears. Occupational hazard, Ethan repeated softly. Also, apparently, personal interest. The accordance ceremony occupied the central amphitheater, a space designed with variable gravity fields so that species from high-grav worlds could stand comfortably beside those who preferred near weightlessness. Ethan stood in the designated human zone, acutely aware that every delegate, observer, and crew member on Nexus-7 was watching. The ceremony allowed participants to formally declare partnerships, whether diplomatic, commercial, or personal, and his decision had generated more gossip than the station's rumor networks could efficiently process. Collins had cornered him that morning with unconcealed glee. The betting pools have you choosing Seraphine at 3-to-1 odds. There's a conspiracy theory circulating that you're actually a Vorath spy. And someone started a petition asking you to reconsider basic logic. Good to know I have such strong support, Ethan had replied, adjusting his formal liaison uniform for the 100th time. Now, standing before the assembly with Ambassador Seraphine waiting in one designated area and Lyra in another, Ethan felt the weight of expectation pressing down like increased gravity. Seraphine smiled with perfect diplomatic grace, her bioluminescence creating an ethereal glow that made her look like something from ancient Earth mythology. The logical choice, the advantageous alliance, the path everyone had anticipated. He turned toward Lyra instead. Her ears shot upward in surprise, then trembled slightly as he crossed the amphitheater toward her. Ethan had spent 3 days learning basic Kaelith from the station's linguistic database, practicing pronunciation until his throat ached and the computer's patience audibly frayed. Lyra of Kaelith, he began, his accent terrible but his intention clear. I choose truth over beauty, passion over convenience, and someone whose ears tell me everything I need to know about what's real. The Kaelith words came haltingly, grammatically questionable, but Lyra's expression transformed. Tears tracked down her face as he continued, stumbling through a declaration that roughly translated to his choosing her completely, without reservation, with all the heart showing his human emotional range could manage. When he finished, Lyra closed the distance between them and kissed him in front of 12 civilizations and approximately 300 witnesses. Her ears pressed forward, trembling with emotion that needed no translation. The amphitheater erupted in a chaos of responses. The Vorath delegation made sounds that the translation devices rendered as approval. The Centauri collective pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that apparently signified fascination. Collins started a standing ovation that half the human contingent joined with bewildering enthusiasm. Seraphine approached them afterward, her luminescence shifting to warmer tones. An unexpected choice, but I think perhaps the correct one. She addressed Lyra directly. Guard him well, he's either very brave or very foolish. Both, Lyra said, her hand tight in Ethan's. Fortunately, I find both qualities appealing. The formal proceedings continued. Other partnerships declared and alliances formed, but Ethan barely registered them. He was too busy being introduced to the 3 other Kaelith delegates, who examined him with expressions ranging from amused to skeptical. She warned you about the siblings, yes? One asked. 17 of them, apparently, Ethan confirmed. 19, actually. She undercounted to avoid scaring you. The delegate's ears angled in obvious entertainment. Good luck, human. 3 weeks later, Ethan stood in the transport vessel's observation deck watching Kaelith grow larger in the viewport, a world of violet oceans and copper-toned continents. Lyra leaned against his shoulder, her ears relaxed in contentment. "Final chance to reconsider," she said. "My family is going to subject you to approximately 6 traditional compatibility tests, most of which involve either public humiliation or questionable food. Will you be jealous if the tests involve other people?" "Catastrophically." Her ears flattened. "I'll probably cause an interplanetary incident." "Good," Ethan said, pulling her closer. "Wouldn't want you hiding your feelings on my account." Somewhere behind them, Collins had smuggled himself onto the transport and was already composing what he claimed would be the definitive ethnographic study of human-Kaelith relationships. The station had established its first genuine cross-species alliance based not on political calculation, but on the simple truth that connection transcended biology. Lyra's ears lifted as Kaelith's surface details became visible. Ready. Ethan thought about everything that had brought him here. The summit, the choice, the willingness to trust what everyone else called jealousy, but he'd learned to recognize as love that refused to hide itself. "Absolutely," he said, and meant it completely.